All right, we'll go ahead and get started now. There may be some people who continue to trickle in, but we've got some great information for you guys and don't want to keep you waiting too long. We want to respect everyone's time. So first of all, thank you for coming today. We're excited to have you here. We have been getting lots of questions about accessory dwelling units, particularly for multifamily properties, from kind of on all sides of the spectrum, whether it's from government agencies or private property owners or developers. And so we wanted to take this time and set up this webinar to really share our information and insight about what's possible and potentially some of the challenges or considerations you might keep in mind if this is something that you are interested in and looking to do in your community. So first, a couple of introductions. Let's see here. So my name is Tony Tomasello. I'm a senior planner here with RRM Design Group in our Santa Barbara office. I focus primarily on permits and entitlements, and as well as do some work with government agencies on really a wide range of project types. So I'm again happy to be here today. And then Bobby, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Bobby Walker. I'm an architect in Design Group. I work a lot in California. I also work a little in Washington, and I've been doing a lot of residential design, and in turn, with these new ADU laws, I've been working on a lot of residential ADUs, and now we're starting to see a lot of ADUs for cities and designing for all sorts of end users, whether it's the multifamily property owner or the city or just an individual owner looking to bring a kid home or a relative or a loved one. So I'm excited to share all this knowledge with you guys, and hopefully it leads to more questions and some fun solutions.
Thank you, Bobby. And then just a little bit of quick background on RRM if you're not familiar with our company and organization. We're a multidiscipline firm. We are planners, architects, civil engineers, structural engineers, land surveyors, and landscape architects. We work on a really wide variety of project types really throughout the state and elsewhere. And, we're open to if you have questions or information about any of our disciplines, we'd be happy to share that as well. So jumping in. So today we'll be talking about, again, specifically ADUs for multifamily properties. We'll go through a little bit of a background and overview of the ADU laws, some of the key and principal provisions for ADUs on multifamily properties. We'll touch on utility connections and impact fees because those are a little bit unique for these. We'll be going through some building code considerations to keep in mind. We have some case studies and examples to share that may help kind of bring it home. And lastly, share a little bit of information about anticipated costs that you could expect. So first, background and overview. So in 2017, there was a series of ADU laws that came out that really kind of paved the way for the current ADU laws that we are familiar with. And then in 2020, there was another series of state laws and amendments that really cleared the way for multifamily ADUs. So the 2020 amendments allow ADUs on multifamily residential zoned properties. As of January 1st, 2020, any local ordinances that weren't in conformance with the new state laws became null and void. And so what you're seeing now is really agencies across the state are working to amend their local ADU ordinances to comply with the state rules and regulations and implement those requirements on the local level. A really good resource for anybody to be looking at is the Housing and Community Development Department, which is a state agency. They issued an ADU handbook that really goes through and kind of breaks down a lot of the state rules and regulations. So I highly recommend that to anybody who's interested in these. So one of the first things that I like to think about as I'm kind of describing what the ADU laws are, is that traditionally when we think of a development project, there's a land use entitlement component and then your building permit component. Land use entitlements are based on local zoning laws. They're discretionary, and there are things like CUP, zoning modifications, etc. Many of you, I'm sure, know that, but just wanted to kind of get us all on the same page. And then the building permits are based on California Building Code. They're ministerial, and the range of players in those are, your architect, your structural, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, etc. And so what the state ADU laws did is essentially kind of clear a permitting path from a zoning standpoint to allow ADUs essentially by right in most cases. So while you may not have a land use entitlement process, a very important thing to consider is that you still have to meet state building codes for these projects. A lot of times we get people who, just think it's extremely easy and, they can convert their garage. And while that may be true, converting a garage to current residential standards is often a lot more than everybody kind of realizes from the get-go. So that's an important piece to just keep in mind. So a couple of key definitions for multifamily ADUs. So an existing multifamily property is one that has 2 or more legal residential units. Often that's interpreted to have received a certificate of occupancy before you would be considered an existing multifamily property. And then mixed use developments are okay as well. They're also considered in that bucket. And then by right development. So as mentioned, these are projects that do not require discretionary approvals, but building permits are still required. Some of the key provisions for multifamily ADUs. So this is something, as I mentioned, as cities and counties are beginning to look at implementing the state ADU laws within their jurisdiction. They, have leeway to kind of craft their ordinances in the way that makes sense for them and their constituents, and as long as they are in compliance with state law. And so there's kind of a wide range of ordinances out there that you've seen or that you will see in terms of how they kind of categorize these or contextualize these. And the one that I'm using as an example here is the city of Santa Barbara, and I will use that kind of as a baseline as we go through. But they categorize them as special ADUs or standard ADUs. And I really like that because it really helps to kind of simplify and understand what category of ADU you may be looking at. Special ADUs allow multiple by right ADUs on multifamily lots. And standard ADUs, key difference is you'd be allowed to do only one by right ADU on a multifamily lot. A couple other considerations. There are some allowances for areas of the city that would not be appropriate for ADUs. So for example, in the city of Santa Barbara, areas of high fire severity zone, you would not be able to do a standard ADU, but special ADUs are allowed. Also, we come across this a lot in this region. The coastal zone is a little bit different. So essentially the state law came out and said that nothing, within that law shall supersede the Coastal Act. And the way that that's interpreted is there may be different requirements for properties that are within the coastal zone, different parking requirements, a lot of the sort of streamlining and exceptions that are available in inland areas aren't necessarily true for coastal areas. So those often have different requirements, and then those code amendments must be certified by the California Coastal Commission, which can really be a multi-year process before those would be enacted in those areas. So there are two types of special ADUs for multifamily properties. The first are ADUs within portions of existing multifamily structures, which are not used as livable space. So this includes storage rooms, basements, garages, other areas like that. There was an interpretation, at least in the city's or local ordinance, that must be fully enclosed. So you couldn't have like a carport, a bank of carports that could be, converted to multiple ADUs. And then in this category, you are allowed to do at least one ADU and up to 25% of the total existing multifamily dwelling units. So if you had a 20-unit multifamily apartment building and you had sufficient space, let's say garages or something like that, that made sense to convert to ADUs, you could get up to 5 ADU units on that property. And the second category are 2 ADUs that are detached from the multifamily dwelling, but there's a few specific requirements for those. They must be, they have a height limit of 16 feet, a maximum of 800 square feet each, and no less than 4-foot side and rear setbacks. A few other key requirements for special ADUs. You cannot combine categories. So you couldn't do, a conversion of a garage under, the 25% rule, and then also do 2 detached ADUs. You kind of get one or the other. So that's important to keep in mind. There are no open space requirements for ADUs, and then if the ADU displaces existing required open spaces that were necessary for the existing multifamily building when it was built, those would not need to be replaced on site. Existing covered parking does not need to be replaced on site. That's comes from the state law. However, existing uncovered parking does need to be replaced on site. It's a little bit of perhaps an oversight in the state law, but that's kind of one nuance to the parking conversation that is really important to keep in mind. There are a number of exceptions to ADUs that eliminate the need for parking. The one that we come up against most often is if you're within a half mile of a bus stop, which is a lot of areas in urban areas, you are not required to provide any parking for those ADUs. And then front setback requirement is the same as required in the zone. So you get the reduced side and rear setbacks, but the front must adhere to what the zone requires. For standard ADUs, so these are ADUs that do not meet all the requirements to be a special ADU. So if you can't meet the height limit, the size, if you want to do kind of a more unique configuration that doesn't fall into one of those first couple of categories, then you fall into a standard ADU category. These allow only 1 ADU per lot, so you have more flexibility, but you are not able to do as many. And then you cannot combine with any special ADUs. So you couldn't do, the 2 detached special ADUs and then 1 standard ADU on the lot. Again, it's one or the other. There are 4 types of configurations of standard ADUs. The first is within existing or proposed primary residential structure, within an existing accessory structure. It could be an addition that is attached to the primary residential or accessory structure, or new construction that's detached from the primary residential structure. And then ADUs built over garages, they could be considered either attached or detached, depending on the configuration. A few key requirements for standard ADUs. So in general, there's a lot more nuances to the standard ADU. So whereas it allows you a little bit more flexibility in your configuration, there's specific requirements depending on that configuration, and that includes minimum size, maximum height, minimum setbacks, etc. Again, there are no open space requirements for standard ADUs, and they allow you to, like if you were going to build it in an existing required open space area, they allow reduced open space requirements for the existing units to accommodate those ADUs. So it doesn't eliminate them the same way a special ADU does, but you at least get a reduction in what's required. The parking requirements are the same as special ADUs. There are often, the state law allows for local agencies to establish objective design standards, and most agencies are doing so. Most of them require you to, the architectural design needs to be similar in style and look as the primary residence, certain requirements about roof materials, things like that. And in general, those standard ADUs need to go through an administrative design review, which is kind of a staff level approval, just to confirm that you're meeting those objective design standards. So the key takeaway with standard ADUs is that there's more flexibility in terms of your configuration, but more nuanced and detailed requirements that you really have to pay close attention to. So final thoughts and takeaways on these. ADUs do not count towards your maximum density allowed in the zone. So if you are built at 20 units per acre on your property, and that's the maximum that the zone allows for, you're still eligible to do these ADUs as long as you meet the requirements. Special ADUs, multiple are allowed, but there's limited flexibility with the configuration. Standard ADUs, only one allowed, but greater flexibility with configuration. And then ADUs that don't meet all the prescriptive requirements could need discretionary approval, or they may not be allowed. And that's really dependent on kind of the nuances of your site and the zone district and how the city is implementing its ADU laws. Moving on to utilities and impact fees. So water and sewer connections. So for all multifamily ADUs, the state law allows the agency to have discretion whether or not to require separate water and sewer connections. In the city of Santa Barbara, separate water and sewer connections are not required. They do require you to install private water submeters. And then because it's often new development or new fixture units within the ADU, a sewer lateral inspection is typically triggered. And if it's damaged, you need to repair it or replace it. Water and sewer capacity charges in the state law, these are treated a little bit different from impact fees, although we kind of often in the development community lump them together. However, for ADUs within the city of Santa Barbara, no capacity charges are required unless a new or additional meter is installed. And if a new or additional meter is installed, capacity charges must be based on the fixture units or otherwise proportional to the existing multifamily development. And that's true in all communities. Other impact fees. So ADUs less than 750 50 square feet are exempt from impact fees, whether it's a special or a standard ADU. ADUs that are greater than 750 square feet are charged impact fees proportionally to the primary residential structure. So the way that the calculation goes is up to the discretion of the local agency, but in all cases they would be less than a standard residential unit. School districts are separate entities, and those districts are able to continue to charge impact fees, so that's important to keep in mind. And then local agencies really have different impact fees, so it's important to understand what community you're working in and whether, and the impact fees that they have applicable within their jurisdiction. For example, the traffic impact mitigation fees, there are none in the city of Santa Barbara, but there are some in the county of Santa Barbara, and depending on where you are, they can be pretty significant. And with that, I will turn it over to Bobby to talk about the building code considerations.
Thank you, Tony. That was great. I feel like I'm learning something new every time we go through that. I know that the cities are still kind of working hard to update what they know, and sometimes even we get different answers when we're calling in the city about the interpretation. So it's great to be continually learning on this and reaching out about those planning items. So Tony talked a lot about the planning side, and I want to get a little bit into building code considerations. And you'll see there's some differences slightly. Everything, even though something may be approved on a planning side, you still have to meet California building code on everything, on the planning documents. So some of that comes into play. There's some overlap. And just the way he's talking about fixtures for your unit, for your new unit, even though you may be approved from a planning side, you may just need to make sure on a practical side that, say, the sewer line you have can support everything that you're putting in. So to start with here, we're going to start with fire setbacks and separations. A lot of questions we get is, where can we put this in the backyard? Can we put it in a side yard? How close to the property line can we get? Can we butt it up against another building? So sometimes the answer is yes, but you want to consider some of the building code considerations. So this is an example site where it was an existing 2-story apartment building. And so we were able to, by right, put 2 special ADUs here. They're both under 800 square feet. They're under that 16-foot height limit. And we're staying 4 feet away from the property line in this case. A couple things came into play. We wanted an egress window in the bedroom. So instead of sticking to that 4-foot separation, that's the minimum, we went to 5 feet. So we didn't have to do special fireproofing in that wall. We have 2 units adjoined to each other. So it's going to be R3 in the building code. From like a planning standpoint in Santa Barbara, Tony may be saying R2 for the zone and whatnot, but the duplex structure would be under the R3 in the building code. So we would be able to do 2 units next to each other, fire separation. And then another consideration here is building to building. So you have that existing building. So just space planning wise, we didn't put any windows on that wall. We did a minimum 3-foot separation, and we're doing those as firewalls so we can get that close together. If you did a duplex like this, for example, and you did those buildings 6 feet apart, you could do an implied property line of 3 feet, and then you wouldn't have any fireproofing concerns. So just because you're at the minimum doesn't mean you don't necessarily want to take a step back and look at your construction methods and costs. Next slide, please, Tony. Fire sprinklers is another big question. This is baked in where if the primary structure, you have an apartment building, doesn't have fire sprinklers, They're non-existing. You don't have to put fire sprinklers in your ADU. If you have a newer apartment building and it was built with fire sprinklers, your ADU is gonna have the fire sprinklers. I put a little side note down here. There's some cases we've run across where, say, you have a single family home and you're updating it to a duplex so that you can get the 2 special ADUs on your site. They may require fire sprinklers, even though you didn't previously have fire sprinklers, and then you may be required to have them down the line in your ADUs. So it's something to keep in mind as you're working through your project. Oh, and I put in here this Santa Barbara over under. We did a project where we took a single family home, converted it to a duplex, and it didn't need fire sprinklers because the remodel was under 75%. So it ended up kind of saving down the line the homeowner more money because then they could add 2 ADUs but not have to put fire sprinklers in either of those. Accessibility. Because of the Chapter 11 being in California Building Code, define the units that are requiring accessibility as at least 4 condominium dwelling units or at least 3 apartment dwelling units. Just by the nature of how these ADUs are working out, if you build 1 detached ADU, if you build 2 connected detached ADUs, if you convert an existing garage into an ADU, it's not going to be required to meet accessibility requirements. There may be some more complexities if you're converting a bunch of spaces inside of an existing larger building that connects to hallways and things like that. It could get a little more nuanced, but for the most part, when you're doing a 1-off ADU, a 2-off ADU, you're not going to need those accessibility requirements. All of these, all this kind of new construction, whether it's a new construction, converted space, you're going to need a Title 24. It's one of the, if a lot of these projects end up involving like a remodel to a space with a new ADU, so it's important to keep in mind that if you're doing a remodel to an existing apartment plus ADUs or plus an attached ADU, a lot of the times you're doing for your remodel can credit you in your Title 24 energy. So things like replacing windows, replacing range hoods, they can really help you be more creative in your ADU design if you include those kind of together in your planning process. And then there's a couple other, some jurisdictions you might have to do a green point checklist as well. Just something to keep in mind as you're working through the project. Oh yeah, okay, sorry, a couple more energy considerations. Just from some experience, but we're moving to a point where if you just do all electric on your ADUs, it oftentimes provides the most flexibility for the amount of windows and fenestration you can have and what appliances you want to use. It's a little more lenient in the Title 24 reports. People like to use custom windows, reuse doors, reuse barn doors, make a front door, something like that. Custom glazing that you frame yourself. Anything that's custom is going to be the worst case scenario in the Title 24 report. So you would have to make up for it somewhere else with a super efficient HVAC system or something like that. Raised heels so you can get more insulation in the roof is a great way to just in the planning stage to allow for more energy efficiency. And again, it'll reduce your costs on things like hot water heaters and other appliances where you would maybe otherwise have to get up into a more expensive, really efficient tier. And another thing that we've been using in California a lot is 2x6 framing to help meet energy compliance. It's kind of been standard 2x6 walls, and the price of framing has gone up so much that many people are now, reconsidering that, maybe looking at doing exterior insulation, and higher heels, more roof insulation, and 2x4 walls really pencils out a little bit better for some people. So where before it seemed obvious to go the 2x6 route, that's changing a little bit. It's a good spot to not be kicking yourself down the line to really think about in the planning stage. So here we have some structural considerations. I am by no means a structural engineer. So this is from the point of view of an architect, just from working with structural engineers on ADUs. Every site that we've seen is unique. So even though you may have one ADU that you like, you got to drop it on a site. There's still considerable amount of work in the site planning and structural engineering phase. So just keep that in mind as you're moving forward. A lot of jurisdictions don't allow just prescriptive design because the seismic load or the snow load in California is so high that you do have to have calcs done by an actual structural engineer. Sometimes you can get away with meeting the prescriptive code and having an architect write out the structural stuff. 3-to-1 length-width ratio. I just threw that in there because ADUs are often not like a typical house, which feels more square in nature. A lot of times people like to do long, skinny structures. If you want to make your structural engineer happy, stay to a ratio of 3-to-1, so 12 feet wide by 36 feet. Don't go longer. You're going to start getting a lot more expensive construction methods. We've been using a lot of just simple single plate structures and doing a lot of height, playing with the height, building storage areas in the attic, doing vaulted ceilings. We've just been doing that with the trusses, and that allows us to keep the structural design simple. A lot of truss manufacturers are happy to design the trusses for you now on the planning stage, as long as you go with them down the line. So it helps in cost a little bit as well. And then these next three are kind of just about structural foundation. Planning is key here. The retaining or the footing, the amount of concrete can really kind of be the budget breaker on some of these projects, especially when you're cramming into these little side spots on a yard where maybe the slope goes down and before you know it, you need a 6-foot retaining wall. So little things like that. We have some projects where we just start with the structural design and then we get into the architecture a little bit, just for the client to make sure it's feasible. Oh, and that last one, this is just a little lesson learned thing, but easements, you got to leave room for the footing to expand past in a lot of cases. So don't design right up to the easement. Leave yourself some room, or leave the structural engineer some room. Here we're getting into an example of a special ADU. So this is what Tony was talking about. You're avoiding that discretionary process, and now you're just getting into kind of meeting the building code here. So you have this, this is the same site I was talking about fire separation earlier, but we have a duplex, it's existing, and it has a carport. So this property has an existing duplex, an existing carport, and one existing uncovered space. So because Tony was talking about that kind of strange rule earlier, but if you demo that carport, we do not need to replace that parking. But that uncovered space, we have to replace that on site somewhere. So this is an example of how we put, it looks like one structure from above, but that's a 2 ADU configuration. We put it behind the apartment building, did not replace the parking for the carport, but combined the permeable patio with an uncovered space to replace that parking spot. And another thing that this site needed was trash, recycling, yard waste. It may not seem huge, but something to consider. It does take a significant amount of space. It can't go in setbacks. It can't go in your parking easement. So it's best to think about it ahead of time. Here's a kind of an example of a standard ADU. So a lot of times people talk about ADUs. They say they want to replace the garage with an ADU, or they want to build a ADU on top of their garage. Because of certain constraints, an ADU like this is typically a standard ADU. So those are the ones Tony was talking about. They have a little bit different rules. Sometimes you can't build them in high fire severity zones, that sort of thing. You cannot do 2 of these detached on one lot. Special ADU previously, you're allowed to do 2. You can only do 1 standard ADU on a lot. So this project in particular had to go through planning review with the city. It's got to match the house. They had a discretionary review. It has to meet all the city setbacks there for height limit. So there's specific standards here depending on the configuration. Here's an example of adding an ADU to a single family lot. So you just, in the front of the, this is an example of a corner lot. So it has 2 front yards. There's a single family home. It has parking spaces, and you're just adding a 750 up to 800 square foot ADU in your backyard. And so because you're adding an ADU, open space is not required. You could technically not have that much backyard. It could be a shorter lot. You could take all the yard as long as you're meeting building code requirements. And so I did make a note down here. Building code, it gets confusing sometimes, but because it's a single family home, I'm looking up R3 in the building code. But if you're in Santa Barbara, a planner maybe talking to you about how you're in an R2 zone. Those are different things for planners and architects. So I'm just kind of pointing that out. Here is the same home, but what the owner has done is they've converted it to a duplex. And then once they convert it to a duplex, 2 or more units is a multifamily. So now you can build 2 special ADUs in your backyard or in the yard space because multifamily can have 2 special ADUs. So there's no open space required. In fact, these ADUs eliminated the open space that was required to do the duplex. So to do this project, you would have to permit the duplex with open space and then immediately turn around and permit 2 ADUs to take up that, that open space. And again, a duplex is the same as a single family home in a lot of ways in regards to building code. So that's why I have again the R3, no accessibility requirements. Here's an example of a multifamily building. So a lot of units in 2 buildings here, big courtyard between existing parking lot off to the left, existing trash, existing bike parking. And so there was space here to add 2 special ADUs. So there's a little bit of space on the side of the yard. You can see there where it's grayed out. We're adding 2 new ADUs. It's 4 feet away from the property line. It's right at that limit. So that wall doesn't have any windows on it to avoid high cost windows that would have to meet fire code requirements. And this is similar in nature to kind of the last one we saw. You know, a duplex is multifamily, this is multifamily. We're able to do 2 new ones on both. And Tony touched on some ways that depending on your property, if you have a lot more open space or you have enclosed garages that are parking spaces for each unit, you may be able to go the other path where you take up to 25% and you convert your enclosed garages into an ADU for each of your units. So these multifamily projects definitely have a lot more, you know, what if we did this? What if we went this route? There seem to be a lot of avenues you can take. And this, just pointing out quick, the multifamily building from a building code standpoint is a different classification as the 2 new ADUs. So once you start modifying something inside the multifamily building, I just disclaimer, you might trigger kind of higher accessibility standards or in the building code.
Great, thank you, Bobby. The last item we'll touch on that seems to be everybody's bottom line question is, well, what is this going to cost? This sounds like a great idea, but is it worth it? And what's going to be the cost? This is means meant to be the end all be all, but these are roughly the numbers that we've seen of the major, cost items for projects that have been going through the process. There's obviously a ton of variance depending on the unique site considerations and configurations, whether you're doing new detached construction or trying to renovate something. So you really need to work closely with your design professionals and contractors, but wanted to put this out just to try to give you an idea of what we see in sort of some of the more straightforward projects. So our example here is a 500 square foot ADU. The architect, planner, structural engineers, may need some assistance from a mechanical, electrical engineer as well. Those are somewhere in the $30,000 to $40,000 range. Other consultants that are really necessary that a lot of people forget about are the soils engineer and the survey, especially if you're in a tight configuration or if you have potential easements on your property. Those are really important to understand. Permit fees, these include your plan check, inspections, and building permit fees. The impact fees in this scenario, we assumed because it's less than 750 square feet, no impact fees are applicable. However, the school fees are, and those range depending on the school district that you're within. And then lastly, construction costs, and again, this is not our area of expertise, but from some of the projects that we've seen go through, they're somewhere in the $250 to $350 a square foot range. And with that, we want to thank you. We do have some time for questions. We're happy to answer those. If you can please go ahead and drop them in the chat box. We'll try to go down the list and try to hit those as best we can. We do have our contact information here. If you have any questions or specific issues that you'd want to discuss, please feel free to reach out. All right, let's start with questions. This one is from Lori Tamura. Welcome. What about stormwater, WELO, and low impact development requirements? Bobby, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah, on the special ADUs, we haven't been required to have kind of any sort of open space or exhaustive landscape plans. We haven't seen any need for that on a standard ADU. I think in a lot of jurisdictions, they'd require that as part of the planning discretionary review. Yeah.
And the stormwater requirements also depend on the jurisdiction. They often have thresholds for what category or what tier of stormwater improvements you may be in. Typically, these structures are relatively smaller, and so we're not triggering the highest tier. But definitely something to discuss with the local planning department and confirm before you go through. Oftentimes, it's kind of standard BMPs that you would include as part of the project. Accessibility requirements, Bobby. I think you touched on that one. Do you want to kind of give a recap on that?
Yeah, kind of that accessibility. People call it Chapter 11B in the building code. If you're doing a duplex at R3 California building code, you're not going to need to meet accessibility requirements. There's some instances where you, depending on what you're doing, you may need to meet adaptability requirements, which are much less stringent. They're a little different. And then if you get into a multifamily building, you would probably need to consult somebody, an architect, something like that, about whether or not it would apply when you're now within a much larger building. But that 2-unit, 1-unit, 2-unit, it won't be required to be accessible.
And it looks like I had skipped one question. There's a couple people asking for a copy of the presentation. We are recording this, and so we're happy to shoot out a copy of the presentation or a recording of it, so we can definitely accommodate that. Question from William: can you provide an example of the proportional impact fee for ADUs that exceed the 750 square feet exemption? So from what I've seen, let's say you had a 2,000 square foot primary structure on the lot and you were proposing 1,000 square foot ADU. If essentially the impact fees would be 50% of what would be required for that dwelling unit if it were permitted as a dwelling unit under the zoning code, if that makes sense.
I think, Tony, we found that, especially in like some of the more expensive coastal zones, I guess, or I mean, not coast, but more expensive zones in California, it is kind of calcing out where people are finding it's okay to go over that 750 and pay the fee and get exactly what they want. It's not adding too much to the total cost of the project.
For a large multifamily of 600 units, can we build a building of 40 ADUs on unused tennis courts? That's a good question. So in order to be eligible under what I would call the special ADU category to do the, up to 25% of the existing, multifamily units, those areas need to be fully enclosed, at least in the jurisdictions that I've come across. I think there is a bit of discretion on what the local agency can consider as existing non-livable space. I haven't seen open space requirement or open space areas like a tennis court or something like that be within that their interpretation of unused livable space or unused living space.
Just for the sake of argument, Tony, just getting creative a little bit, could you potentially make those into garages on the tennis courts, and then after the garages are permitted and finalized, convert the garages to ADUs?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would need to defer to the local jurisdiction and how they're interpreting the state laws and implementing them there, because there is a little bit of discretion that they can have, within the confines of the state law. In general, those areas are intended to be, fully enclosed, non-livable space like garages, basements, storage rooms. The state law mentions passageways, which I really haven't come across any corridors that could easily be, retrofitted to be, reasonably livable unit. So we don't see that one used as often because it's quite frequently there isn't a ton of non-livable space in some of these larger apartment buildings to convert.
Looks like Peg has their hand raised. Are we able to?
What was that?
Looks like Peg has their hand raised. Are we able to unmute them for a question?
Oh, Peg, is it possible to put your question in the chat box? I don't know if we have.
Here we go. It looks like it's unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry that I did come in late. I am working with RRM and David on a large residential project. We are also putting on an ADU, and I was just curious. As I said, I came in late, so I sincerely apologize. Does the state of California and/or Santa Barbara County mandate that you provide a parking garage for an ADU?
It depends on where it is. If there are parking requirements for proposed ADUs, unless you are eligible for, there's like 4 or 5 criteria to be exempt from providing parking. The one we come across most often is you're within half a mile from a bus stop.
We have a 9-acre parcel. Does that make any difference?
That may. I would. I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's kind of specific to the unique site constraints, but certainly something that maybe we could follow up with you on.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, those exceptions, parking is required for an ADU often, but those exceptions are often so easy to meet in a dense kind of a city area that it's kind of overlooked. But on those larger properties where you don't have public transportation, that sort of thing, you may be required a parking space for one bedroom or multiple parking spaces for 2 bedrooms, something like that.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. It looks like that's all the questions, and we've got just about 5 minutes left. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up here. Again, thank you so much for all of your guys' time. We appreciate you joining. And again, if you have any specific questions that you'd like to talk about with us or others, please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.